Hello, this is Monarchism Unfiltered, and I'm Iam.
I'm mkoqsc.
And this is me, Bronze.
And on today's topic, it will be nationalism. Abstractly defined, though, as the listeners may well know, we will eventually veer their soft into monarchism.
So, what specifically were you? I know that you were inspired to this topic specifically because the SNP is sort of thinking of attempting another independence referendum, which may or may not go as well as last time, considering the fact the Spanish. Sorry, I was just going to say the Spanish have refused to allow them in, but sort of beginning from that point, what sort of were you thinking of discussing, mkoqsc?
Two main things: the dynamics of nationalism in of itself, its relationship to republicanism in an abstract sense, and how, generally speaking, nationalists are pieces of shit. But we will get there when we get there.
Strong words.
Hey, we have to get political somehow.
And we're going to get jiggy with it, as they say.
As they say. I mean, I think, I think there is the obvious question of, the question of the origins of nationalism. I think are quite interesting, just because of it oftentimes accounts of nationalism, especially in the 19th century, would ascribe sort of modern nationalist tendencies to movements that could not really be said to be nationalist in any sort of serious sense, or sort of societies that were not particularly nationalist. I think obvious examples of this would be the ascription of nationalist tendencies or qualities to places like the Roman Empire or pre-revolutionary China. And I think that's this kind of like tendency towards fictionalizing one's own history has been quite strong in the study of national identity, more so almost than it has been in any other area.
And that's by design, I'm afraid, because when we're talking about nationalism, there's more than two schools of thought on the matter, but there are only two schools that hold any water, to be more accurate. We have the modernist school of nationalism, and you have the ethno-symbologist school. It's not ethno-symbologist. The symbologist school. The name is escaping me. But basically, you have these two schools that dictate the origin of nationalism, and these two schools, are essentially both the same thing, which is to say, modernist. Essentially, the modernist school defines that nationalism was a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, give or take, largely used for political gain, in which it was the instrumentalization and the creation of an ultimately artificial identity, a fabrication, for the sakes of legitimizing state power, specifically in Republican context. Though some monarchies did do an oopsie and also use it. They would, and what fat lot of good that would do them later down the line. The other school, the ethno-symbologist, basically affirms much the same, but says, they take inspiration from older symbols. It's not all completely fabricated. And this is and again, romantic nationalism was the high point of this, where, for example, the national epic of Finland was completely made up during literally this period of national awakening. Many national epics, although not necessarily composed, were only given a central import during that time, and oftentimes their role in later historiography was exaggerated. So, for example, the Portuguese national epic was important when it was written, and then lay fallow for 300 years, Then nationalism came in Portugal in 1910, it all of a sudden became the most central thing ever, and everyone everywhere learned it and loved it. It is this specific recasting of history to create this mythos of a unified eternal nation that comes to the justification of the existence of the state and, again, of nationalists. Even though in nearly every single scenario, the nation is just that, a fabrication, an imaginary community of sorts.
So with this, with this point about the imaginary community, and especially this idea of the creation of a nation, how specifically do you think it interacts with sort of pre-existing ethnic identities? So especially you see this like in the Holy Roman Empire, there definitely was a sense in which they were German, even if we could not ascribe like nationalist tendencies to them. By the end period, it becomes the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So, to what degree would you see a continuity between prior ethnic identities and then reconstituted national identities?
I mean, then we get into the although important but often ignored debate between a state nation and a nation state. The base divide is that a state nation is a state in which clearly the nation was created by the state. A picture perfect example of this is the Portuguese nation. Why are the Portuguese people called Portuguese? Because the state was called Portugal. It is on that level of this is trivial that it typically that state nations are the case. This is the case of, say, almost all of Southern Europe, bar the Balkans due to a number of circumstances, can be said to be state nations, in Greece inclusive, no matter what they tell you. Nation states are typically those more ethnic based. Like Germany is considered the archetypal nation state, in that the nation of Germany predated the state of Germany. The example of the Holy Roman Empire, the German nation, is typically given as that. But the issue here is that we must understand that words change their meaning. It was the empire of the German nation in the same case that Portugal and Spain could be considered kingdoms of the Iberian nation. Like, we must not forget that at the time the term was descriptive rather than prescriptive. There was not a German was a German. There was simply no actual definition of what a German should be, basically. If you lived within a certain geographical consideration, you were German. Another thing to note of this, and especially more to the point, was that there was no basically a Bavarian was a Bavarian. Fucking Jesus Christ. A Franconian was a Franconian, a Hanoverian was a Hanoverian. These were all identities in of themselves and of equal prestige and value, as opposed to a more unified, neutral, or whatever legitimizing factor you can give to a wider set German nation. The German nation was constructed on essentially the long and short-term graveyards of the latter. And that's kind of the issue. You often see this, I mean, nationalism always precedes and is directly connected to centralization of power. I mean, a rather gruesome example in a way is France, when I can't remember when exactly it was, but France used to have hundreds of dialects of French. Now it's reduced to so little, and they're all slowly dying off. Why? Because during the various French republics, there were campaigns of, and I referred for like the fifth or seventh time here. There are schools in southern France with a beautiful inscription of be clean, speak French, in what used to be sometimes Occitan-dominated areas. You see this imposition of what a nation is and should be onto people, onto basically everyone. This especially this formalization This instrumentalization, is more so the hallmark of nationalism. So there is a question so one could even wage the question: wait, so is a nation separate from nationalism? Is another question that is sometimes asked. My position, my particular exclusive position, is that the distinction may be true, but it is ultimately pointless, because, simply put, the act of instrumentalization, a nation changes it, typically for the worst. If there can be said nations to have predated the advent of nationalism, which I debate extensively.
So you would sort of not consider that to be, because I mean we do have references so I think there are references to like nationhood prior to the rise of modern nationalism.
But those cannot be given serious credence, because first, the meaning of the word was different, and second, by the same token, the Germans were a separate race, the Iberians were a separate race, the French were a separate race, the Italians were a separate race. Everyone was a different race, because all of these people were at one point in the past referred to as a race. See the point? The word in and of itself, we shouldn't be focusing on the word itself, but more so the meaning and its context.
The language game that's played with it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I do see that point. I think it is very interesting. This question of like when can we sort of talk about modern nations, and like at what point? And it does seem that at least within the context of Europe, it can only come about after the French Revolution, in any sort of serious capacity.
The Maestro talked about that extensively.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more extreme example is obviously places like Italy, where minorities of the population minorities of the population had understandings of mainline Italian.
Mainline Italian was just Tuscan Italian.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not even Tuscan. It's like Dante's dialect, which is
Florentine.
Yeah. Well, not. I mean, not even Florentine. I mean, it is literally Dante. Dante is the person that it's based off, but that's sort of kind of in line with Florentine. In some places, it isn't. Florentine of Dante's day. I think nationalism, though, where it does get very interesting is especially in like more modern times. So within like especially now and the way that national identity continues to play out, even though there has been these pushes by things like the EU towards post-nationalism, or I think even you could use this example with the US, where the US has kind of in quite short succession constituted a national identity for like very distinct groups. I mean, Italians, I think, is probably the best example, where like Italian Americans have kind of basically abandoned their ethnic identity within 2 generations, basically. And I wonder what specifically you think about things like the concept of Europe a nation, or even just American nationality in general.
We have to understand that nationalism is but a specific instrumentalization of group consciousness. Well, not group consciousness, but group identity or self-identity. And the issue is that the supranational doesn't exist, or if it does, it will only be for a comparatively short time, because by exactly the same processes that led to the development of a national identity in the 1900s, a development of a greater collective identity or traditionally at the expense of the constituencies, as was the case with the various states and contemporary America, as will be the fate of Europe and the various of Europe and the various and its various nationalities vis-a-vis an emerging European identity. The issue is not that my ultimate issue is not that this will happen, because as far as I'm concerned, it's one fabrication replaced by another. Fails to rise any emotion from me, as it were. The issue is that this is just nationalism. It's just bigger scale and not that substantively different. So my answer is ultimately it's more of the same, but on a slightly different scale.
I mean, you mentioned that it's specifically sort of Republican. What, or that created it? What specific reason do you see for how nationalism tends towards republicanism? Because it does seem that is the case, at least, especially if you look at like the relation.
But even to this day, for example, UK Republicans, just their angle is always to move the English or the British nation forward. Basically, like all Republican arguments, especially in a monarchical context, just bottom out into a bizarre kind of nationalism, a kind of let's bring the nation out of the past and into the future / present. The nation is time to be independent. They might not be rampart nationalist. Heck, they may even be pro-immigration as far as the more right wing of our listeners may be concerned. But this is still nationalism. The relation this has to republicanism is twofold. You have the emotional one and the logical one. The logical one is fairly self-evident. Nationalism, outside of the belief that nations have a right, that nations exist, and that humanity is divided into nations. That's like the bottom of the barrel definition of nationalism. The belief that humanity is divided into nations is also the belief that nations have an inherent right to self-determination, and that states exist because of nations. This last one is kind of a big one, because even, for example, say you're a monarchist, but you're also a nationalist. You think nation, like the nation is the big cheese, as it were. The issue is, if the state exists for the sake of a nation, why shouldn't the nation have an input on the state, basically? For the constitutional monarchist, this is a eye roll, and to them, more power to them. They're being coherent. The head scratcher starts being when you have semi-constitutionalists and even absolutists who will fucking salute the nation, which is kind of nonsensical. More so for the absolutists than the semi-constitutionalists, sure, but the fundamental logic is just that. If you assume that the state exists because of the nation, why shouldn't the nation have an input in the country? That is trivially true. In the emotional aspect is that, I mean, the emotional aspect is a bit of a misnomer, but you essentially have herd mentality, basically, and you have a basic appeals to a kind of vindictive, I should say, self-righteousness, populism, basically, and appeals to we the people, and to we the people vis-a-vis you experts or you elites or what have you. Typically it comes from the emotional angle, a kind of, I mean, what was the term? The last recourse of the most wretched of man goes with the quote. Because above all is that this link is kind of like the base justification, well, the historical justification of republicanism and democracy. Democracy has decided to abandon it since the 40s, and we're starting to see that come back in a big way, I suppose. What with the natural inconsistency. Because again, many listeners will say, "Oh, but many republic nowadays are not nationalist," and my answer is, for how long though? Because when a republic is fundamentally an unnational or anti-nationalist, as it were, it is playing a very, in hindsight, kind of dumb game. Because let's go here for a bit of a Republican/Democratic logic. The best informed people make better decisions. This is a triviality, I would hope. So why shouldn't people base their decisions on the information that they are a nation, basically? What many anti-nationalist or indifferent on the matter is. Or indifferent on the matter is saying that, yes, although you are part of a nation, you really shouldn't act based on that information. Because why? Reasons, really. I mean, there are reasons, but there are too many to be worth enumerating in this particular case. And the fact that nationalism is rising so much in these past days is that, well, turns out people are becoming aware that they're a nation, and, well, that does indeed impact voter tendency. Who knew?
I mean, I think also there is this point that the sort of elimination um, of almost all kinds of identity other than national identity to constitute national identity, and then the elimination of national identity just kind of leaves people with national identity, and so then they want to go back to the previous thing, rather than yeah,
It ultimately just bottoms out into increasingly more psychotic levels of nationalism. Because, dear listener, what we're saying is that we're opposed. I mean, I'm not even going to I don't know about Bronze or Iam, but I'm going to again speak myself. Because, as you might have guessed, this is a very mkoqsc episode. Is that I'm opposed to nationalism because it destroys local culture. Because local culture, be it that of the town, be it that of the region or the locality, be that what it may and what shapes it may be, is more intrinsically genuine, honest, and real than any nation that has ever been conceived of and exists. Simply put, the act of creating an orthodoxy on what a nation should be is nothing short of murder to these local cultures. Because more often than not, under the guise of conservatism or what other swill there is, they often reduce traditions, living things that go from time immemorial, to dead, static things that are prohibited from change. Identity, beliefs, and just sheer existence are not dead things to be kept in a museum, and every couple of years we pantomime a kind of bizarre, vacuous, and meaningless revival. That these local identities are needlessly suppressed for the sake of nothing of a something that amounts to nothing more than a godforsaken painting is pointless and destructive. So my position is I am opposed to national identity on the basis that regional identity is both A, more honest and real, and B, less harmful. What comes is what goes rather than what is imposed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think also what is quite interesting about, so I mean, obviously in the UK there is the continual debate about Scottish independence, which is largely motivated by sort of economic concerns. So the fact that without Scotland or Wales, there would not have been a Labour government since the 50s, I think.
No, until Blair, and
until Blair. Okay, yeah. So Blair. Okay, yeah.
I mean, you can argue about how Labour he was, but
I mean, yeah, but I mean that's kind of the point. That's mad. Yeah, I mean, yeah. On that basis, then the Lib Dems, I think, entirely exist because of Scotland and Wales, and I mean that I think is quite an important point, at least with regards to the resurgence of nationalism in Europe. I think it is in large part caused by the fact that Europeans do feel like their governments have failed them to a significant degree, that post 2008, even earlier than that, with things like
Modern day nationalism contemporary nationalism, so post 1900s, goes back to the 1970s, with the Pojadist movement, especially its more populistic branch.
I mean, I mean, obviously the Pojadist movement did sort of shift the right in its direction.
As if you like, no, we're going to discuss it, but it is one of the most hilarious things, because you oftentimes, and I read papers on this on a semi-regular basis, from, not entirely of my free will, because academia.edu loves to bombard my inbox, but sometimes they do bombard it with interesting stuff. And most of the papers I've read concerning like the reaction of governments from basically the status quo in Europe to the rise of the far right populist parties has been laughable to the downright insulting. Because to really break it down to you here, listener, it is almost as if they were trying to trace a genealogy, because that's often what it bottoms out to: a who's who of fascism, that is wrong on face of it, because first it ignores the fact that most fascists post World War II became pan-Europeanists, because at the time the big debate was against the Americanization of Europe. So the Pojadist movement was a break because it was a nationalist party in the sense that we understand it today, as opposed to most fascist parties as they manifested themselves in the 70s. So they're trying to trace a genealogy that is pointless and misses the point. Most far right parties these days have, if any at all, almost no connection towards previously extant nationalist parties or dynamics. Sure, now that they're growing, they might have adopted a few hangers on, sure, but that's besides the point. None of these parties are just revivals. There are new things that again come closer to the Pojadist movement of the 70s than any old hoary ghost of the 30s and 40s. But most of the analysis seems to be focused on, again, Nazis and fascists, rather than any substantive understanding of the situation as it manifestates today. So sorry for this sidestep.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, I think the more interesting point to be made, especially recently, about the resurgence of nationalism in various places, I think it is in large part motivated by these economic concerns and the breakdown of the breakdown of the spell. Because it's sort of, if you look at post the collapse of Soviet Union between the 90s and 2008, there was not sort of serious challenge to the dominant order, but I mean that lasted about 20 years, which is not all that long. I think the interesting point there is that if you look at these groups like Catalan independence or Scottish independence, a lot of these groups are very I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but basically it seems that their kind of response to economic downturns has largely been a kind of myth of
not because sure
a myth of self-determination. Sorry, this idea that, you know, if Scotland gets to determine how it runs itself, or if I mean, it's slightly truer with Catalonia because they're richer than the rest of Spain.
Yeah, like literally, it's not because they're poor; it's because they're rich and refuse to pay. Like that's the issue. It's not even that they're rich and refuse to pay; is that they're rich and are somehow still a net drain on the country. Because not only do they barely pay taxes to the center, they're also a net fucking drain. Because oftentimes, in order to placate them, to placate the nationalist parties, as it were, they basically require what tantamounts to bribes bribe money that often is in the multi-millions that could be invested in more poor regions. But it isn't, because basically Catalonia enjoys threatening that it will leave. Because I'll concede that Scotland might have genuine economic grievances. Sure, that is valid. That is not the issue at discussion. But it is trivially true that in the current economic framework, not even the conjecture, but just how economics is set up today, that if they left the UK, they would be poorer than they could ever have been under the UK. And even if they became richer, they would still have been less rich than what they could have potentially been under the UK. These are because basically the legitimate concerns about unequal distribution of wealth are valid, but they are being exploited on a pointless and frankly self-harming and suicidal endeavor of successionism in the modern day. Like, it goes nowhere and leads nowhere. But, well, obviously the leaders of the National Party getting a fat paycheck and all the prestige that their petty power mongering always made them crave. That's the issue. Like many of these nationalist movements are just textbook party manipulation of the people for their own detriment, as is traditionally the case. 80 god fucking percent of all wealth in the UK is produced in London. This is bad and should be debated. The way to answer this is not, oh, Scotland must leave. What actual benefit would that bring to Scotland, to the Scottish people themselves, other than...
I mean, there's talk of the devolution of the North Sea oil money, but...
I mean, I think that the North Sea oil money is not going to go anywhere. I mean, like, who would they sell it to?
Yeah, this time...
Because yeah, I mean, I think the Germans get most of their oil from Russia, and then it's likely that the Iranians are going to set up a pipeline sometime soon.
Yeah, because getting oil out of the ocean is very expensive compared to pumping it from land, where all you need is a pump.
Yeah, and then also Turkey's going to start piping stuff from Azerbaijan, which is why Armenia was able to be beaten by, and why no one gave a shit about it, and why the Turks wanted to beat Azerbaijan, because the Azerbaijani oil, that and then the Iranian oil, and then they all want to sell it to the Germans because the Germans are the main people who buy all that oil. Basically, it seems to me that the amount, like, even if there is some marginal amount of North Sea oil, it's not going to be able to support the Scottish economy. But I do think more fundamentally, there's this kind of myth idea that, you know, economic self-determination means that it will be more efficient, which just seems kind of like an insane idea. I mean, like, Asda or Tesco's or McDonald's are more efficient than like little mom and pop equivalents thereof, which is usually why they're cheaper than those places. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like another issue is just sheer economy of scale, basically. Like, should the Scottish people demand better distribution of resources? They should. It is well within their rights. Is the way to demand better rights to demand sheer independence? I mean, no, because let me give you this example. Let's use the example of Catalonia, which is the one I'm more familiar with. If they were to become independent, the amount of taxes they pay, both real, the sheer amount of real taxes, would almost triple. And that's how low they can keep the taxes artificially. The moment an independent Catalonia would have to fund its own police force, to fund its own army, to fund its own navy, to fund its own air force, to fund its own national healthcare service, to fund literally all the other things that it is the central government that pays for them. that they still refuse to pay for themselves, their quality of life will simply start decreasing tremendously, because all of a sudden they're going to be the ones to footing the bill they don't want. Although I do, on both moral and ethical grounds, say they should foot it irregardless, the issue is the myth of even greater prosperity that is promised is just that, a myth, if not an outright lie.
Yeah.
Another aspect I think we're somewhat ignoring of this is the like, okay, so we so far have been like approaching, no, like economically it no longer makes any sense. Like if you want to make the world in the sense that such self-determination could be viable and true and what have you, more power to you, but try to treat the disease, not the symptoms, is what I would say in that regard. But others would raise objections. Okay, but cultural distinction, like say Bavaria vis-a-vis the rest of Germany, religious distinction, Bavaria versus the rest of Germany in the European context, and all that. And the answer is simple-ish. Are the people being victim of genocide? Yes or no? Are the people being persecuted? Yes or no? Are they being disadvantaged? Yes or no? Only if the first one is true, they're being genocided, then in which case they should seek independence for the sake of survival, then sure. The other two, even unless they are both accurate, even then, I would still like be doubtful of giving independence on those merits alone, because especially independence on the ground of, oh, the cultures are distinct. The trivial answer always remains, there is more internal distinction within a group than outside of it. All European nations are similar to one another by virtue of being Europeans. Each and every single individual region within that nation is more distinct than the nations themselves. By that token, what keeps North Bavaria from separating from South Bavaria? Well, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that's not the exact division. But what actually prevents a further and further subdivision into oblivion, basically? The issue is that you could give tremendous amounts of answers, all of them, because the notion, not necessarily nation, but notion of Bavaria is that strong, then that wouldn't happen. And my response would be, in the 1800s, the notion of British was so strong that Scotland wasn't called Scotland, it was called North Britain. And now look at where we are. So, simply put, that a notion is strong means nothing, because it can become weak again, or start becoming weak, depending upon the exact time frame. So that kind of reasoning just increases a greater and greater atomism. Another thing, especially of this rationale of self-determination for nationalism, is that it engenders perhaps the most heinous aspect of nationalism, which is a race to genocide, basically, be it cultural or literal, all things told. The overall framework of this is fairly simple to explain, of how just invariably genocide gets on the table, both cultural and literal. Well, both are genocides, but when I say literal genocides, I mean the death squads, the death camps, you know the drill. Cultural genocide is, I suppose, more indirect, but not necessarily less traumatic. Because here's the reason, right? What is the actual impetus for negotiation between two parts, assuming that we talk about two parts? The onus is always in the independence seeker, because it's seen as their intrinsic right, upon which no infringement is allowed. Yet the independence keeper, I suppose, has the intrinsic right of not wanting to be viciously dismembered and therefore reduced into a romp state. A very intense example of this is Spain. 20% of the country's wealth is in Catalonia, and if Catalonia leaves, even though Spain barely manages to tap into that wealth, the wealth itself acts as an attractor to investment, which is kind of important. It would result in a very bad deal, for Spain. And not to say that the Spanish are considering genociding the Catalonians, but that the Catalonians are considered genociding the Spanish within their borders is a different matter altogether. Low-level persecution has been a thing for years now. Not that anyone really cares. The base assessment is exactly this: the independent seeker simply has an endless justification to never to negotiate or seek an agreement, or independent seeker. The nationalist simply has the endless justification to never seek an agreement and to always try to succeed for their own selfish gains. And this just leads into a slow and steady decline into genocide, because one side has to give, and if it isn't cultural, then it will be literal, as was the case of like Abkhazia and the Georgians living within Abkhazia, which got genocided, both literally and deportation. Though I think deportation does count as literal genocide. So because again, no side was willing to negotiate. This is trivially true not only in the topic of like national identity, but also on sub-national identities. For example, political identities. You see this a lot, where the goal is to either remove all distinctions from the opposing group, so much so that they become different in name only, or they're complete and wholesale crushing to the point that they become irrelevant. This dynamic is intrinsic to republics. Add this onto nations nationalism, and you get a very, very worrying cocktail.
I mean, I think that's a good place to leave off. I mean, I don't have too much else to say.
I think that's pretty much a good summary.
Fair enough.
Yes, I mean, I don't have too much else to say. This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts. I am.
I've been Bronze.
And I've been mkoqsc.
Good night.